On page 142 in my book, Development of Christianity. Essentially, I'm going to start back a little ways. The Jews had returned from Babylon, and a lot of them had not liked what had been going on in Judea. So a lot of them began to fan out and move out all over the empire. You'd find Jewish colonies in Greece and Macedonia, throughout Asia Minor here, Italy, Spain, southern France, and even they expanded out east into what is today Iran, but what was then called Persia. They expanded Persia and into Parthia, what is today called Pakistan. So the Jewish people were scattering all over the place. Now, here's where this helped the spread of Christianity, which came later. Everywhere these people went, the Jews, that is, they set up synagogues. They did not generally try to convert their neighbors. You only became a Jew when you were born into it. So they didn't convert their neighbors, but they at least taught their neighbors that they believed there was only one God and that God had a moral standard, that God was going to someday send a promised Messiah. Just the basic stuff that they taught their neighbors about Judaism. Their neighbors would ask, well, what do you do in the synagogues? And the Jews would tell them. So the message of the one God, monotheism, began to spread throughout the empire without making any real converts. Now, the Jews had a habit, and Muslims still to this day, they try to go once in a lifetime back to Judea. All right, now in AD 30, there occurred a special high Passover, where the Passover occurred on a Sabbath day. That only happens like once every 7 years. But this time, Passover occurred on the Sabbath, so a lot of Jews came from all over the empire. And they didn't just fly in and stay at a hotel for a few days. They came any way they could get there. I mean, these people in the Western world traveled a lot. That's something we're going to mention later, because the Chinese people didn't, but the Europeans traveled a lot. But anyway, they would come from all over the world, and they'd stay for a while. Stay at least a couple of months visiting their distant cousins, renewing old acquaintances, then they go back home. So keep that in mind, because when Jesus was crucified, he was crucified one day before the high Passover. He was crucified on Friday. The next day was Saturday, which was a high Passover. And the people who came from all over the world saw these events. Then 50 days later, which the word Pentecost means, but 50 days later, a lot of them heard the disciples speak in their own languages. And then they went home and told all the things they'd seen in Judea. So the initial message began to get across. Now, also, the time was really ripe for the spread of a new religion. The old religion, the worship of Jupiter, the worship of Mars, the worship of Venus, just seemed to be inadequate. A lot of Romans worshiped the sun. In fact, more of your high-up Romans, your higher classes, were involved in the worship of the sun. But the religion seemed becoming more and more empty and more devoid of meaning, as the gods did not seem to want to help them or seemed too fickle to help them and would not talk to them anymore. The oracles had ceased to work, as I've already mentioned. The mystery religions, they somewhat filled the gap, but I talked about the mystery religions in connection with Hellenism. The mystery religions only took the more successful, generally only took them in. They left most people out. Also, the mystery religions had really harsh initiation ceremonies that a lot of people were afraid of. I mean, hey, the idea of an initiation ceremony killing someone is not anything new. It happened in the ancient world also. An initiation ceremony could bruise a person up pretty badly. But Christianity had none of this except for maybe baptism, which was never considered very rough. But also Christianity took in everyone, anyone who chose to join. All right. Paganism was mostly tolerant. However, there were a couple of religions paganism didn't tolerate. Druidism, which had its base here in Ireland, which was a very, very evil religion that practiced human sacrifice, among other things. The Romans eventually outlawed that, and the Druids went underground, and Christianity eventually was outlawed for reasons we'll talk about in a few minutes. Anyway, into this scenario came Jesus of Nazareth. He came into a Western world that was at least politically unified. He did not travel far. Now, as far as his message goes, folk, every history book you look at is going to have a different message, and I'm not exactly happy or enthused about what the authors say. You can read it for yourself. Your authors emphasize the message was simple. Well, I couldn't agree more about what the simple message was, and I'll leave that topic for the moment. Anyway, he claimed that he was the Messiah. This was a crime under Jewish law. For this, he was executed by means of crucifixion. And his followers claimed that he rose from the dead. Now, folks, this is one time I really don't want a discussion. Whether or not he rose from the dead is something each individual has to decide for himself. What is important, though, is his followers for the last 2,000 years have believed that he rose from the dead. And this belief was to change the whole course of Western civilization. Anyway, according to the accounts, supposedly 500 persons saw it. He ascended into heaven 40 days after his crucifixion. 10 days later, 120 of his followers were able to speak in the languages of the people who were gathered outside the temple. And they heard it, then these people began to disperse. I mean, they stayed there from Passover to Pentecost, which was 50 days, Pentecost being 50 days from Passover. Anyway, the people who saw it went all over the empire and began to spread the news. This was the beginning. In the meantime, the followers of Jesus at first stayed right around Jerusalem and would have probably stayed there, and Christianity might have died out. Except the Jews did not like the message. They persecuted the followers, which forced his followers to scatter. And they began to scatter to the Samaritans, then to the Jews living close to Judea. Then they became missionary-minded, and they went all over the Roman Empire. And some stories say they even went to Russia, to India, to Ethiopia, but they fanned out. And as they fanned out, the first place to go was to a Jewish synagogue and tell the Jews that, hey, your Messiah has come. When most of the Jews did not believe it, Paul of Tarsus said, well, hey, I'm going to the Gentiles. So Paul converted a lot of Gentiles. In fact, the Gentile converts greatly outnumbered the Jews, and the movement of Christianity was underway. Christianity had its problems. One problem was the problem of heresies. A whole lot of diverse doctrines came up. And another problem, of course, was Gnosticism, mystery religions, paganism. Eventually, the Roman government turned against it under Nero. And from Nero on, most of your emperors actively persecuted the Christians. The persecution did little to actually slow down or stop Christianity. Christianity spread in spite of the persecution. And as I've already mentioned, finally in 312, an emperor named Constantine converted to Christianity himself. And when he did, he issued the Edict of Milan. I called it the Edict of Toleration last time, but the book calls it the Edict of Milan, which stated that Christianity was now a legal religion. Persecution was over, at least for the time being. Eventually, another emperor made Christianity the official religion of the empire, and paganism was dead. All right. What was the reason for the spread of Christianity? There were several. I've already mentioned a couple of them. One, they seemed to offer more to more people than the mystery religions. It would take in the rich, the poor, the sick, the crippled. the uneducated. Another very important reason for the spread was it promised a happy afterlife. This was something that mankind had not seen before, hardly ever. The Sumerian religions had promised a very dismal afterlife. Greek and Roman mythology promised an extremely aimless, or that you become zombies, just with no mind, just barely know you existed, very aimless afterlife. So that there was nothing much to look forward to in paganism as far as an afterlife. Christianity promised a happy afterlife, and all you had to do was believe. And if there was anything that could be called initiation, it was baptism. Other than that, it was easy to get in. Another reason, folks, that Christianity was not a mystery religion was Christianity had no mysteries. It was quick to tell everybody what it believed, quick to go about trying to encourage converts, make converts, proselytize might be the word. Again, they were building on the foundations that had been laid by the Jews who had scattered throughout the world and taught the people some basic things about the Jewish God. And then built on the foundation of some of the Jews who had seen some of the events in Judea about the time of Christ's crucifixion and went back home and told what they'd seen. And built on the foundation of the fact that there were Jewish synagogues located all over this part of the world from which the Christian missionaries would launch their platform, you might say. And from there go to the Gentiles. And a lot of Gentiles became converts. Now, another reason for the spread of Christianity was simply that Christians lived noticeably longer than anyone else. Your average Roman lived about 22 years, but if you discount the infants, the infant mortality, and some of the infants were deliberately put to death, but if you discount the infants, they still only lived about 33 years. Christians lived an average of 50 to 60 years. Now, there have been some studies done even today in modern times and say that people of faith, and that's not just good people of faith, live a few years longer, not as much as in Roman time, but noticeably longer than people who are not people of faith. People of faith, they say, are more likely to recover from cancers, more likely to recover from heart attacks or other illnesses that might take out other people. One reason, though, that Christianity became popular was in Roman times, when a person caught the plague, everybody would abandon him, leave him, and desert him, and leave him alone to die. It is known that half of the people who caught the plague could live if there were just somebody to take care of their basic needs, to clean them up once in a while, bring them food and water. Christians would stay around and do that. As a result, a high percentage of people who caught the plague recovered, at least the ones who were tended by the Christians. And persons who saw the courage of the Christians would oftentimes convert and say, hey, if what they have is good enough for them, it's good enough for me. So that helped. Now, this, folk, I hate to say, but in the 1300s when the Black Death hit, church people deserted their followers in droves. That didn't last. Of course, the Black Death was far worse than the plagues. The Black Death was a disease that in those days, once you caught it, hardly anyone, if anyone, ever recovered. Whereas the Roman plagues, you had a chance. And also they noticed, once a person had the plague and recovered, he would likely never get it again, which meant that the person who had recovered from the plague might make a good nursemaid for persons who had the plague, because we now know that these persons who had the plague and recovered had built up some kind of an immunity that other people didn't have. Another thing that helped the spread of Christianity was when Christians were persecuted, a lot of times they'd flee. And when they'd flee all over the place and scatter out all over the place. And this actually helped Christianity more than it hurt it. fact, your book even mentions what has been said down through the last couple thousand years, that persecution made Christians stronger than would have if the emperors left them alone. I'm reminded of a story from one of Robert A. Heinlein's science fiction books, that there was a certain candy factory that didn't want its employees to eat candy. So they posted signs that any candy could be eaten anywhere, even the finished product, take the wrapper off and eat it, no restrictions. Guess what, folks? After a very short time, there was no more candy eaten. Basic psychology, you tell a person they not to do and they're going to do, allow them to do, and after a while they get sick of it and won't do it. I mean, I could go on with other instances about that, but basically,